It's a good day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? Bitch boy Millzy. I'm the Hometown Commander. And we're back for another episode of Millzy Updates, the show where I update you on what's going on in my main deck box or my test box. I'm going to do the last of my main decks for my Wilds of Eldraine updates, mainly just because we're already in Doctor Who at this point. And I'll probably update my main decks again when we get to Ixalan. It's easy to do it every couple sets as opposed to every set, because not every set brings cards for our new decks. But today we're talking about Miirym, Sentinel, Wyrm from Baldur's Gate, a Temur Dragons commander, and a deck I've had a ton of fun playing in the past. The deck's changed slightly since the first time I built it, but it's kept the same core strategy. Miirym is a 6-mana 6/6 that has flying in War 2. It says whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield under your control, we make a copy of that, except it's not legendary if that dragon is legendary. So Miirym's trying to get us to get dragons onto the battlefield so we get copies of them and profit. Now the copies, unlike other cards that make copies, don't have haste. So part of the deck we're trying to do is give the dragons that come in haste so we can attack with them. But our deck is going to generally try to win in two ways. The first is combat. We have a bunch of big flyers in the air. They're going to be hard to deal with. And so we can win the game via combat, and we have plenty of ways to do that. We also have aggravated assault and the accoutrements to take infinite combats if possible, or enough combats to end the game. And we're in the air, so our opponents aren't necessarily going to have an infinite amount of blockers to block us, and so eventually we will push through for lethal that way. But the second way we're going to win the game is with effects like Terror of the Peaks, Scourge of Valkus, and a couple others we'll talk about. So basically, there's two versions of these effects. The first is things like Terror of the Peaks and Warstorm Surge. That say whenever the creature enters the battlefield under our control, that we deal damage equal to that creature's power to any target or target opponent or what have you. So if we put a 6/6 dragon in, 6 damage gets dealt to a target of our choice. And the other ability is Scourge of Valkus and Dragon Tempest, which both say whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we deal X damage to target creature player, where X is the number of dragons we control. Now, the cool part about Dragon Tempest is it does actually give those flyers that come in haste, whereas of course Scourge of Valkus doesn't. But again, this number goes up the amount of dragons have. We play a dragon, we go from 2 to 3 dragons. Okay, now we're 3 damage, and then Miirym makes that copy, getting us up to 4 damage. So the normal play line there is we're putting dragons in, getting those damage triggers, and start spreading them around, and then maybe we don't have to end the game via combat. We have some big dragons, 7/7, 8/8s. Dealing that 8 damage around is going to do us a lot of good. Now, the main way that the deck is trying to do this is trying to cheat them in for cheaper than we would otherwise. We have things like Sneak Attack and Cryptic Gateway, which we'll talk about when we get to the artifacts. That will allow us to pay our player dragons for really cheaply, as opposed to playing full cost, because Miirym doesn't care how they came in, she just cares that non-token dragons came in. In the mana base, the goal is to get our mana up there quickly, because Miirym and all the rest of our dragons are fairly expensive. So we want to make sure we get up there. We are playing the Ancient Tomb as well as I am playing the Ursa Saga, because this is the only deck in my main box that I run a Mana Crypt in, and so that's one of the reasons I run the Saga, is for the Crypt. Of course, I do have also artifacts that we can get off of Saga besides the Crypt, but it's the main one that we want to go get. Nykthos is a land I really enjoy, because the more permanents you have on the battlefield, the more devotion you have. Remember that when you make a copy of a permanent, you're going to get the copy with its devotion, with its mana pips on the card. So you're going to get actually more devotion when we make these copies. So Nykthos becomes actually pretty important for getting the mana we need. Getting into the enchantments, it's pretty much a big mix of, token doublers, ways to get creatures in, and other generally good stuff. We talked about the Ag Assault, 5 mana to untap all creatures. After this main phase, there's another combat phase followed by initial main phase. So as long as we can get 5 mana somehow, this is basically going to allow us to continue to take combats over and over and over again, and allow us to keep hitting into our opponents. Doubling Season is going to both double the amount of tokens we make and double the amount of +1/+1 or any counters that we put On a permanent, we do have a few things that put +1/+1 counters on things. Not very much, but we do. But it's mainly here to double the amount of tokens that Miirym is making. Dragon Tempest, which we talked about earlier when we talked about that part of the game plan. Whenever a creature with flying comes in, it gets haste. This is good because this counts for both our non-token dragons coming in and the token ones. And it says whenever a dragon enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to target creature or player where X is the number of dragons you control. So every new dragon coming in is going to see the amount of dragons we have and deal damage. Elemental Bomb, whenever a creature with 3 or greater comes in, we draw a card. This, Garruk's Uprising, and Temur Ascendancy all kind of have this similar effect, and these are all really important because it says nothing about non-token. And so when we play a dragon, we're going to draw, and when we make that copy, we're always going to draw because all of our dragons are 3 or higher. Garruk's Uprising is a little bit different. When it comes in, if we have a creature with power 4 or greater, we draw. All of our creatures have trample, and then every time a creature with power 4 or greater comes in, we draw a card. And that's the same with Temur Ascendancy. So we have a couple ways to draw when creatures are coming in. Another way we have to draw is Kindred Discovery. Whenever it comes in, we choose a type, which is always going to be dragons for this deck. And whenever a creature you control with chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, we draw a card. And the reason that Kindred Discovery is big in this deck is because we need to get to some of these pieces that are going to help us in the game. We are a combo deck at the end of the day, so Kindred Discovery will help us get there. Molten Echoes is another fun way to make tokens. It says when it comes in, we choose creature type. Again, always going to be dragons in this deck. Whenever a non-token creature of the chosen type enters the battlefield, create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste, and we exile at the beginning of the next end step. Molten Echoes is really fun because I'd say we put a Balefire Dragon in, we get a copy from Miirym and a copy from this, and the copy from this that can attack, and we can use that right away, and the other two can stay back to block, or of course if we're playing something that gives all of our creatures haste, then everything can attack. But again, Molten Echoes is good because it gives us another trigger for the purposes of these effects. Parallel Lives is to double the amount of tokens we'd make. Rhystic Study for the draw. Rhystic Study sees a lot of love and hate in the community, but it does really well. I actually pulled a Mystic Remor out of this deck for Kindred Discovery because I realized that Kindred Discovery is going to be a lot more impactful in this deck due to how many dragons we have coming in and attacking, whereas Mystic Remor is only good, the more that our opponents do. Rhythm of the Wild gives creature spells we control can't be countered, which is great, and then non-token creatures have riots. We can give them haste or a +1/+1 counter when they come in, and this is great because then all of those creatures we're dumping in to get copies, the originals can have haste, and then the token can stay back and block. Well, Sneak Attack is one of those ways we can win. This is for a red mana. We can put a creature from our hand onto the battlefield. It gets haste, and we sack it at the beginning of the next end step. This is good with Miirym because for a red, we're putting any creature we want in our hand down on the battlefield. It gets haste. We get the copy off of Miirym, and then we always have that dragon, still staying back. We just get to use that one this turn. 5 mana to a Sneak Attack can help you end the game, depending on what you're putting down and what token doublers and and what things we have on the battlefield. Sylvan Library for the draw. We don't mind paying the 4 life to get an extra card to get into our pieces if necessary, and it just helps us see more cards. Temur Ascendancy, giving all of our creatures haste, is very important because then we don't care about, we don't need to necessarily sneak attack or anything like that. If we have all of our creatures have haste, get in, attack with both of them, get the damage, and hurt our opponents that way. And then we talked about the Warstorm Surge being very similar to that Terror of the Peaks style ability. Well, getting up into the artifacts, we have Arcane Signet, of course. Although we are a green deck and we're playing lots of land ramp, we still want to take advantage of the cards we have access to. Carnelian Orb of Dragonkind's a fun card. It taps for a red, and if we spend that red on a dragon spell, it gets haste. That's pretty cool and can be very helpful depending on what we're putting in. Cryptic Gateway was the card in Dominaria Master that I'd never seen before that I was like, ooh, this is a Miirym card for sure. So we can tap 2 untapped creatures we control to put a creature card from our hand that shares a creature type with it, tapped this way onto the battlefield. So what this basically says is, and how the loop is basically going to work is, we put a dragon down from our hand somehow. Let's say we cast a dragon. Miirym makes a copy of it. We now have 2 of those creatures in the battlefield. We can tap them for this ability because they're, even whether they have haste or not, we're tapping them for this ability and not for their own abilities. We tap the one we played and the token copy of it, put another dragon down from our hand, and repeat that process. And if we have Shared Animosity or Warstorm Surge or Terror of the Peaks, we're eventually going to start nuking out our opponents just by having enough dragons in our hand, and that's where things like Kindred Discovery come into hand to get as many dragons in our hand as we can. So we're either sneak attacking them in, or we're doing things to kind of get them down, get the damage spreading, and help us end the game. Curse Mirror, come in as a copy of any creature in the battlefield if we want it to be, except it has haste. This is great because if we have a non-legendary dragon on the field, or we made a copy of a legendary one already. Cool. Curse Mirror comes in as a copy of that. It is a non-token creature, so it's going to make a copy of it, and then we're getting more triggers, and we're off to the races as far as that goes. Dragon Horde's a great mana rock, because it is a mana rock at the end of the day. We can tap it for any color, but whenever a dragon comes in, we put a counter on it, and we can tap it to remove a counter from it to draw a card if need be, and that's very helpful. There have been turns where you're like, I have more than enough mana, I just need to get more cards in my hand, and it does a good job at that. Of course, we talked about the Crypt, very notorious commander card. Beginning of our upkeep, we flip. If we lose the flip, we take 3 damage. Add double colorless, 2 colorless mana to our mana pool. Just helpful, especially when all of our dragons start becoming 8-9 mana, 6, 7, 8 mana. Crypt is going to help. Again, this is my only main deck I play Crypt in, just because Miirym's 6 mana and you want to get there as quickly as you can so we can start playing other dragons. Mirror Box just makes a ton of sense. Legend rule doesn't apply to permanents we control. This is important specifically for Miirym more than anyone else. We want to, of course, get multiple copies of her if we can, because then we get to make more tokens. It says each legendary creature with gold gets +1/+1. Well, that's just great in combat, then they get a little bit bigger. But here's the important one. Each non-token creature you control gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control with the same name as that creature. So our non-token creatures are going to get buffed for how many tokens of it that are out. So this is going to help in those scenarios where we put a legendary creature down, get the non-legendary copies, but they still count for Mirror Box, and then those big legendary creatures are getting buffed, and it helps us out. And then in combat, those dragons start hitting harder, and we need less and less combats to end the game. Panharmonicon, if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield would cause a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers in additional time. This is specifically for Miirym, but this also helps with all the rest of those damaging permanents go off twice instead of once. So a Panharmonicon effect is great because it not only does it double Miirym, but it doubles the Dragon Tempest and the Warstorm Surge and the Scourge of Valkis. So it's going to help us end the game quicker. Soul Ring and then the Sword of Feast of Famine and Reaver Cleaver are both here for Aggravated Assault. Sword of Feast of Famine, when that creature deals damage to a player, we untap all lands we control and they discard a card. The Reaver Cleaver says that creature gets +1/+1 trample, and whenever this creature deals damage to a player or planeswalker, create that many treasure tokens, and then we could use the treasure tokens to activate Aggravated Assault. But the goal of both of those is either one, have more mana to play dragons with, which is still a thing we want to do, or if we have the Aggravated Assault, use it to take those extra combats. And then the Great Henge, whenever a creature comes in, we put a +1/+1 counter and draw a card. But again, it can come down cheap most of the time once we have a few dragons down. It taps to add mana and gives us life. But again, mainly it's drawing when another creature, non-token creature comes in, which could help us continue to feed our hand to keep putting dragons down. One of the cards that didn't make the cut this time around that I was really, really close on was Virtue of Knowledge. This is from Wilds of Eldraine. Because its main ability is basically Panharmonicon. If a permanent entering the battlefield will cause a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers an additional time. And I liked it because I was like, well, this is just another copy of Panharmonicon. But the thing that stopped me back was the adventure side. Copy target activated ability or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Yes, this is near perfect for Aggravated Assault if the trigger is stacked the way I want to. I just didn't have a ton of other activated abilities I could think of in the deck, but I could see Virtue of Knowledge coming in really quickly because it does everything we want. Is everything we want, Panharmonicon to do, and more effects like that are just, again, going to synergize with the rest of the cards in our deck. I just wasn't sure where to put it. As well as the other enchantment I really wanted to add was Mirror March. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you flip a coin until you lose a flip. What most people would do in a random commander game is they'll take a dice and say, okay, I'm going to call odds and roll it. If it's odds, then I call it right. If it's evens, then I call it wrong. But for each flip you win, you create a token that's copy of that creature, and those token gains haste and exile at the beginning of the end step. To me, it's a fun way to add a little bit of randomness to the deck and just have fun. You may win 6 flips, get 6 copies of the creature, and if you have that Warstorm Surge out or that Scourge of Valkis out, now you're just going to start doming people for damage. So those were 2 of the enchantments that I really want to bring in. I'm just not 100% sure yet on slotting them in, but they're going to be the things next time I take a look at the deck list that I'm probably going to end up bringing in. As far as our enchantments go, we're playing Deflecting Swat and Fierce, our Free commander spells, Deflecting SWAT can change the target of spell or ability and can be cast for free as long as we control our commander. And then Fierce Guardianship can counter target non-creature spell and can be cast for free as long as we control our commander. Miirym is a lightning rod for removal because it's a great card. So Deflecting SWAT will protect it, and so will Fierce. But to be honest, Fierce is more often save me from Farewell or a spell like that where someone's trying to wipe the entire board rather than just get rid of Miirym, because there's going to be a point in the game where once you have a big enough board set up, Miirym's negligent. I mean, yes, it helps us make the tokens, but if I have Scourge of Valkus and let's say and a Dragon Tempest out, I just need to start hard casting dragons from my hand, and I'm going to end up doming people for enough damage. And we have creatures in our deck that will allow us to draw a ton of cards, make a ton of treasures. I mean, there's going to be no lack of drawing cards and mana to do it. So Miirym helps us get there, whereas other things are going to help us over the finish line. Force of Vigor. If it's not our turn, we can exile a green card from our hand rather than pay its mana cost to destroy up to 2 artifacts or enchantments. This is in here for combo protection. So many decks as you get higher up in the power scale of commanders start winning the games via combat or combos, especially at instant speed. And Force of Vigor is something that's going to help us hopefully deal with that. Growth Spiral for a little bit of ramp. Draw a card, put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. But what I like about Growth Power is in the early game, this is ramp. In the late game, this is draw a card, try to hit another dragon to put down. Heroic Intervention to protect the board, giving all of our permanents hexproof and indestructible, not just our creatures. And this can be beneficial in a lot of ways. Protect from a board wipe, stop somebody from returning something to our hand or fighting one of our creatures. If we're in combat, if our opponents have really big creatures or have a lot of death touchers, we could block for free with all our big dragons and give them indestructible. There's a lot of ways we can use Heroic Intervention. It's a great card. A card that I added probably later than I should have, I've seen played once in the deck so far, and it did a really good job, was Kindred Summons. Since we choose a creature type, always going to be dragons. Reveal cards on the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards of the chosen type, where X is the number of creatures you control of that type. Put those cards on the battlefield, then shuffle. This will probably end the game if you have at least one Scourge of Valkus or Warstorm Surge or whatever, because the more dragons you have, the more that are coming off the top. If Miirym's out, you're getting tokens of all of them, then you're getting those triggers again. Again, this card is really good, and it's well worth 7 mana, because if I'm only drawing, let's say I had, Kindred Discovery, draw 8, I only draw lands. Well, our Kindred Discovery, draw a bunch of cards, I'm only really drawing lands. Well, we know the dragons are in there, and I know I can find enough dragons off this ability to make sure it basically will end the game at instant speed. The cool part is it is instant speed, so you could wait till someone else's turn. Kindred on their turn if they threaten your board and do it all at instant speed, and a lot of people aren't going to be able to deal with this type of effect at instant speed unless they have single target removal to remove the right things. But again, you could always wait till they try to remove the right thing and do it that way. Reality Shift for a little bit of removal, exiling a target creature, and then Worldly Tutor can just put the right creature on top. If we know we need that Scourge of Valkus, we need that Terror of the Peaks, we can load it on top and have it ready to go. Or we have other dragons that do great things that we could load on top as well. And I like the things like a Worldly Tutor because, yes, it goes on the top. But we know exactly what we're getting and we can draw it the next turn. Blasphemous Sack for some removal. And I picked specifically Blasphemous Sack because it combos with a dragon in our deck. We have a dragon called Wrathful Red Dragon. It says whenever a dragon you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target that isn't a dragon. Well, with at least, it would have to be 9 dragons on the battlefield, or 8 plus Wrathful Red Dragon. If you hit Blasphemous Act on that board, I have, 9 dragons that each took 13. I deal 13 3 times to each opponent, and you're probably going to knock anybody out unless we're all still sitting at 40. But again, most of the time at that point in the game, at least 9 dragons on board, and a Blasphemous Act is going to end the game due to those triggers. But also, a Blasphemous Act just deals a large amount of damage that's going to take out most creatures, and it's going to be darn cheap to do it. Expressive Iteration for the early game. Look at the top 3, put 1 into your hand, 1 on the bottom, and play 1. I always recommend if you're playing Expressive Iteration to do it before you play your land for turns, just so if you hit a land off the 3 and you have to choose land that way, you're not completely dead in the water. Farseek, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, 3 visits. All of our ramp spells, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 visits can all go get my Triumph, or can all go get my Shocklands if I want to do that. Rampant Growth can only get basics, but again, we are playing a few of them. Arenicus's Foul Duplication is mainly in here to copy Miirym, because it becomes non-legendary when we copy it with Arenicus, but it can copy a lot of other things, so it's still beneficial. It's just this is mainly in here for Miirym. And then Jessica's Will, get the red mana, get the Impulse Draw, exiling off the top three, sorry. Most of the time it's in here for the red mana to allow us to play, a couple things on one turn, or even, get to Miirym a turn early, depending on how many cards we have and the right, set of lands we have. Before we get into the creatures, we'll talk about our one battle, which is the Invasion of Tarkir. When I read this card, I knew immediately it was going in the deck. So on the front side, it says, when it enters the battlefield, reveal any number of dragons from our hand. When you do, it deals X plus 2 damage to any other target. It X's the number of cards revealed this way. So we can hit an opponent with it. We can hit a creature with it. And again, it's only 2 mana, so early in the game, we have lots of dragons in our hand. This can hit hard. And then it turns into Defiant Thundermaw, which says whenever a dragon we control attacks, it deals 2 damage to any target. This is going to help us if we go down the combats route of the deck, because just declaring an attack is going to deal damage, and we might be able to work an attack out where on attack we deal enough damage to certain players to knock them out and then have a better time in combat. So I like this card. It's well worth the 2 mana. Yes, we have to attack it to flip it to the backside, but it is more than worth it. The dragons in this deck have changed. I've been trying to rotate some in and out to see how they play and see what's beneficial and what's not. The 2 most recent additions to the deck is Tyrant of Care Ridges from Brothers War. It says when it comes in, it deals 4 damage to any targets. This is great because it is going to do this already when we copy it and get that extra token, and then we're going to get any of our effects. So one of these with a Miirym and any other damaging thing on board is going to at least be 8 damage, and then the rest of our effects, so I like it. And the other one is Blast Furnace Hellkite. This card's a ton of fun. It's a 9 mana 5/5, so it's a little expensive. We can cast it as though it had flash by sacrificing an artifact and paying the difference in mana cost. So if we have an artifact we no longer need, we could sack it and pay it for a little cheaper. Has flying and double strike, and double strike's a great ability, especially once we're getting into combat. But here's the big one. It says creatures attacking your opponents have double strike. This is not just our creatures. This is every creature attacking our opponents has double strike. This can help us in the game by encouraging our opponents to attack each other, but mainly it's just going to give all of our creatures double strike, which is something that a Tarka does as well, and that's just going to help our dragons hit even harder. So they're effectively doing double their damage every turn, which is going to help end the game sooner. But the rest of our dragons, we're playing 2 of the ancient dragons. We're playing Copper and Silver. Copper, when it deals damage to a player, we roll a d20, we make that many treasures. This is part of one of the dragons we want to get if we can, because it's going to help us give a bunch of mana. And Silver does the same thing, but draw that many cards, and you no longer have a maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So one of these guys is great to see in the early game because we can put it down, and as soon as we hit someone with it, unless we're rolling a really low number, most of the time we're going to generate a lot of value, and it works out really well. Astral Dragon is a really fun card. Astral Dragon plus a Doubling Season or a Parallel Lives, and one of those Scourge of Valkis, Terror the Peaks, Dragon Tempest will help end a game very quickly. I believe, I forgot the number off the top of my head, but Astral Dragon plus Doubling Season makes an insane amount of copies of Doubling Season. And then once that's done, if everyone's still alive, you just need to make one more token, put one more dragon down onto the battlefield, and you're just going to end up doming your opponents for the rest of the damage needed. Astral Dragon goes to make the Doubling Season, copy the Doubling Seasons, so you end up making 4 Doubling Seasons, and and it just goes from there, and it can become a mess. But again, they come in as dragons, so they do activate Scourge of Valkis and all of those abilities as well. And then if we have Panharmonicon or something like that out, we're getting more and more of those abilities. But Astral Dragon's great because it comes in, can give us extra copies of the things we care about. We could even make extra copies of Dragon Tempest. We can make, depending on what we need for what our hand is, and I think it's well worth the 8 mana. Balefire Dragon just got that great reprint in Commander Masters. I actually didn't have it in here before it got reprinted, but once it did, I was happy too, because it says whenever it deals damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. So if you have someone who's on the ground who's building up their board of tokens or whatever, you can get in with the Balefire Dragon in the air and just sweep their board with damage. And the cool part is if we give Balefire Dragon double strike, on first strike it deals 6 damage to each of their creatures, and then on regular strike it deals 6 damage, and it could then completely wipe someone's board depending on how big their board is. I like Balefire Dragon. It's well worth the 7 mana. Dragonborn Champion's a really cool card. It says whenever a source we control deals 5 or more damage to a player, we draw a card. When I first put the card in the deck, I thought that meant I was looking at it at combat. I was like, this is great. every big dragon I swing in with is going to draw me a card. But no, once Scourge of Valkust or Dragon Tempest start dealing enough damage, this will actually draw you a card every time they do damage to a player. So that's pretty great too, because it's going to allow us to draw into more dragons. So I can see something like this, plus that Cryptic Gateway, plus enough things to help us go in, get the game done. Earthquake Dragon's a really fun dragon because it costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of dragons you control. And remember that when we copy the dragons with Miirym, they copy their mana value. So it's going to almost always come down for 1 green mana. It's a 10/10. So for the purposes of Terror of the Peaks and Warstorm Surge, an Earthquake Dragon with Miirym out is now 20 damage that we can deal to something, to 10 twice. And then we can sack a land to return it from our graveyard back to our hand if somebody, puts it into the graveyard. But Earthquake Dragon's a great card. It fits everything we're trying to do. And if we ever attack with it, it's a 10/10 flying with trample. Gain Axe, whenever it enters or another dragon enters, we get a treasure. And this is cool because, of course, when it comes in, we'll get the 1. When Miirym makes a copy of it, we will get 2 treasures. So we'll be up to 3 for just playing the 1 Gain Axe. And then every other dragon that comes in, we're going to get treasures, and this will help us go forward on our plan to get as many dragons in as we can. Gold Spam, whenever it attacks or becomes target of a spell, we get a treasure, and then treasures have tapped to add, sack to add 2 mana of any color instead of 1. So this helps us even more with these treasures that we're going to have and use to either play dragons or do other things. So Gold Spam is great for that. Inferno of the Star Mounts is a 6/6 that can't be countered, flying haste. And it has the ability that for a red mana, we can give it +1/+0 until end of turn. But when its power becomes 20 this way, we can deal 20 damage to any target. I have yet to use this ability. I have gotten close. But it is a possibility. You could just put a few of your extra treasures into pumping it up and getting that extra damage in if need be. One of my favorite dragons, and I've done a whole deck with Klauth in its own right, but this is such a fun card. It's a 4/4 dragon that says when it attacks, you add X mana in any combination of colors where X is the total power of attacking creatures. Spend this mana only to cast spells until end of turn. You don't lose mana as steps and phases end. So we attack with all of our dragons with Klauth, make a ton of mana, and it carries through to our main 2, which it normally wouldn't. And now we get to potentially go off, cast all of those dragons, do all of those things. And so I love Klauth for that reason. The best part about this in Miirym is Miirym makes a copy of Klauth, which means we have 2 Klauths the turn it comes down, and we're getting 2 separate Klauth triggers. We're going to net a ton of mana. Now, remember, we can only use them to cast spells. But again, it's kind of what we're trying to do anyway. We're trying to dump all these dragons in and get all this value. So if we have Klauths out, we're not going to be able to use that mana to do something like sneak attack, but we don't care. We'll pay full price for these dragons to have. If we have 30 mana floating, I'll happily pay full price for these dragons to get them in to get the abilities. Laughless, whenever another non-token dragon enters the battlefield, create a 5/5 creature token with flying. Again, this continues to play into this dragons coming in, dealing damage strategy of our deck. Now, it is only every time a non-token dragon comes in, but we don't care because it's just an extra 5/5 that comes in and domes for damage. Gnawbone is another way for us to get treasures. This actually does also factor into our aggravated assault, but more often than not, Old Gnawbone just helps us go off that same turn. Whenever a creature we control deals damage to a player, we create that many treasures. Well, when Gnawbone comes in, we get a copy of it. If we have 2 of them, we're making twice that many treasures, and you can start to see where that goes. Gnawbone's a great creature in its own right. It's 7/7 in the air with flying. But again, getting more and more treasures is exactly what we want. We're playing 2 creatures that aren't dragons, but come in as a copy of any other dragon, any other creature we have, Sakashima and Spark Double. Both of them can come in as a copy of Miirym if we want to. Spark Double says that it comes in with that creature, except it's not legendary if that creature is legendary. Sakashima says it comes in, but now the legendary rule doesn't apply to permanents we control. But either way, both of them can copy Miirym, and if we copy Miirym, Miirym will see Miirym coming in and making a copy of it. Of course, the Miirym coming in won't make a copy of itself, but the first Miirym will make a copy of the Miirym coming in, and now we have multiple tokens being created every time a dragon comes in. Savage Ventmaw is in here specifically to combo with that aggravated assault, but it also just adds 6 mana every time it attacks, which we can use to play more dragons main too. Scourge of Valkust we talked about up top when we talked about the strategy, but it says when it or another dragon enters the battlefield under control, we deal X damage to target creature or player, where X is the number of dragons we control, and we can give it that fire breathing ability to bump it up if need be. We talked about Terror of the Peaks. hitting for that Warstorm Surge effect. Udvara Hellkite, whenever it attacks, whenever a dragon we control attacks, I apologize, we make a 6/6. So again, this completely continues to factor into this dragon's coming in dealing damage philosophy. And the best part is Udvara Hellkite doesn't even have to attack to get this ability. So if there's a turn where we play the Udvara, get the copy of it off Miirym, and then attack with our other dragons, we're getting 6/6s off both of their abilities. And then we talked about that raffle. This deck is a ton of fun to play. I don't play this deck as much as I'd love to. I want to try to pull this out more often because it's a really fun deck to play. It can be kind of hand dependent. You got to get the right dragons at the right time to get your staying power down. But if you can get the right dragons, you can end the game by combat before you even get into any of your combos, depending on what table you're at. It's a ton of fun. This is my favorite 3-color combination, and I get to play all the red-green dragons that I really love. The blue in the deck when I first looked at the card, was going to be, wow, we have these copy effects, but then we got things like Astral Dragon and Silver Dragon that just end up being really good. The blue in the rest of our deck helps us out with card draw. I don't consider this to be a CDH deck by any means. It's probably a high-end power level as far as EDH goes, which is why I don't play it all the time. But it's a deck that I really enjoy, and I hope that I can continue to enjoy in the future. Balefire Dragon just got that reprint, right, in Commander Masters, and that allowed me to add it. We get a fun dragon like Tyrant of Care Riches that we'll see if it stays in the deck. But again, it just goes to show you that sometimes, that card like Virtue and Knowledge can be an easy add, even though it's not a dragon, to do what we want the deck to do. The deck list will be down in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments. What cards am I missing from Miirym? Let me know, and I will catch you guys next time.